Most of the great mysteries of One Piece pertain to the Void Century, the period that stretches from 900 to 800 years ago, where the likes of Joy Boy, Emu, and many others were involved in a great conflict that engulfed the entire world and determined the future of mankind. But what about before that period? What do we know that happened prior to the year 600, and what were the events that led to the Void Century? You may think there's not much we know, but it's actually an incredible amount, even before the Harley. So just to be clear, I'm going to focus on the things we know happened for a fact during that period. Here's a history lesson going into the period prior to the Void Century. The world as we currently know it should be familiar to us all. Its most distinguishing characteristics are the Red Line and the Grand Line, two colossal structures that partition the world into four parts. The continent of red soil splits the world vertically, while the Grand Line ocean route splits it horizontally. The remaining four oceans are mostly flooded in water. And yet, the so-called world, or Sekai in Japanese, did not always look like this. There was a time, thousands of years ago, when the planet looked very different. It was still in big part covered in water, but it featured many large continents, without including the Red Line. According to the Harley text, this planet at the time was referred to by the name of Earth, or Chi in Japanese. That was also known to the people of the moon as the planet Blue Star, or more literally Blue Planet, due to the water that covered a large part of it, though definitely not as much as that of today. The revelation of the Harley text, particularly the fact that they refer to this world by the name of Earth, seems to pretty much hint at the idea that this world and ours were sort of one and the same. Though it seems more logical that the two aren't literally exactly the same, but rather that the One Piece world is an identical version of ours but with some variations. Fundamentally the same thing but with different details, like slightly different topography and continents, civilizations, and events that make it its own unique fantasy world, but still very accurately match those of our own current world of the year 2000 plus. At the very least, the thematic symbolism of it being so similar is so evident that we can at least get a good idea of the similarities. Little is known of how this Earth planet came to form in the world of One Piece, but by studying our own world history, we can likely understand at least the general idea for the geological eras that led to its formation. This includes the formation of the moon, the single satellite that orbits the planet. Life also eventually took form upon the planet. Several ice ages and extinction events took place across many geological areas stretching for billions of years, and eventually life developed into what we know is the oldest period of the planet's history, the era of the dinosaurs. This era of the dinosaurs, first mentioned by Vivian Little Garden, refers to the larger stretch of time in which ancient animals known as dinosaurs ruled the world, as the prevailing predators during those periods. This period, identically to our world, which once again matches those similarities, was said by Queen in chapter 1028 to stretch for hundreds of millions of years. This is the same as our Mesozoic period, which lasted from about 252 million years ago to 66 million years ago, where the large majority of dinosaurs went extinct in a large extinction event. It's been mentioned that dinosaurs also disappeared within this world of One Piece, but in this case in particular, some dinosaurs did survive. In our case, they essentially became the birds of today, but in this world, it seems that entire species of more traditional dinosaurs did in fact survive in select locations, unless they were somehow brought later, Jurassic Park style or something like that, which would be a slight difference from our world. But for the most part, they also very similarly vanished, and so the era of dinosaurs ended, and animals would develop until the simians would evolve into the human. Humans then grew and evolved and developed civilization. This takes us to some of the oldest, more concise dates in the story. The oldest of all that doesn't comprise the distant era of dinosaurs is the sprouting of the tree of Omniscience Phoenicians, the tree that housed the library of Ohara many years later. This ancient tree was said to have an age of 5,000 years, making it incredibly ancient. Our first date of ancient civilization would be the creation of Alubarna Palace. It was mentioned that the palace held 4,000 years of history, implying it was erected as far back as 4 millennia ago, meaning the civilization in this area has existed for at least that long. This once again matches with the history of ancient Egypt, the inspiration for the Alabasta Kingdom, which is believed to have been around for like 5,000 years, and some of its oldest constructions, such as the pyramids, are over 4,000 years old as well. Civilizations continued to develop until humanity became more industrialized and advanced. Records show that a great industrial revolution propelled mankind to make unprecedented breakthroughs into the realms of science and technology, again matching our world. One of the historical remnants of this ancient technology has remained in the ancient sites found on the moon. Because it was left mostly untouched during the whole events of the Void Century, the moon's ruins have remained largely intact, which Enel discovers during his cover story, unearthing the presence of an ancient civilization. This civilization even had murals that depicted the colonization and industrialization of the moon, where in ancient times the race of winged hominids some call angels managed to reach and colonize the moon, establishing there a colony that was known as Burka. This comprised 3 slightly different variations of angels, what are currently culturally known as the Skypians, Shandians, and Burkans. There they even developed a race of artificial robots known as the Karakudiningyo, or mechanical dolls, often also translated as automata dolls, to assist them, and seemingly had electrical power that also powered their entire civilization. It's even been potentially suggested that they may have created some form of artificial atmosphere, given how Enel was able to live and more normally breathe and move on the moon. However, ultimately the moon did not have enough resources to realistically sustain it long term, as it is fundamentally a barren wasteland of Earth, and so the moon people, Tsuki no Hito, descended back to the planet below. However, their longing to one day return to the moon would remain in the legends of fairy Verth. Now, here's the tricky thing. We don't know exactly when the colonization of the moon happened, as we don't have a hard date for it. However, it's been suggested that this happened prior to the Void Century, particularly because the Shandians, one of the 3 races seen in the mural, was known to live in the golden city of Shandora since even prior to the Void Century, suggesting the colonization may have happened at minimum over 1,100 years ago. If that is the case, considering that around the Void Century was when technology was rediscovered, then it must have been in the First World, or the technology simply wouldn't have been there to be used. Some scholars have however proposed an alternate theory that the moon may have been colonized not during the First World, but during the Void Century, simply by some group composed by all 3 species of angels from different islands and cultures coming together to form a new settlement. Fundamentally, this theory is proposing that it's not that these angels later became 3 separate tribes, but rather that 3 tribes came together to form a new civilization during the Void Century rather than the First World. Perhaps this may even have been done as a way to escape the floods to somewhere they'd never reach, but ultimately failed to maintain their civilization long term and so descended back to the world below. This would perhaps explain the already unique clothing of these 3 types of people in these murals being so similar to what they'd use later, and the fact that poneglyph script is inscribed upon these murals as well. However, unfortunately, we can't really say for sure whether the colonization of the moon was in the First World or during the Void Century, and this is made even more confusing as the moon is literally depicted between the first and second worlds of the Harley mural, literally split in half, not really clearly explaining to which side it belongs. Personally, I think that at this point, especially knowing more about the First World, it makes more sense that this colonization came during the Void Century, but hey, at the very least, I thought it was worth mentioning here, in the case it really did pertain to that First World. Going back to what we know for a fact at least, in the First World, the rapid development of technology led to a potential for prosperity, but also to a risk for humanity to fall in the depths of greed. As after all, as a famous scientist said, it may not be possible to control the greed of living creatures. In their search for new renewable energies to not depend on fossil fuels, humanity developed the Mother Flame, a form of nuclear power that is endlessly regenerating. We know this to be a form of nuclear power since the kanji for the power plant that produces it is literally that of nuclear fusion plant. And this is the tale that we are told in the sacred text of Elbaf, the Harley. While this eternal power could have served to bring bigger prosperity, humanity grew arrogant. The few rich at the top monopolized the Mother Flame in order to attain more wealth and power, and the wealth gap between the poor and the super rich class widened further. The workers beneath them were described as enslaved, forced to toil away for the sake of their masters above, and so humanity suffered and wept. People became so desperate that they prayed for liberation, hoping that someone could free them from their suffering. And from those wishes first appeared a peculiar character by the name of Nika. We know quite a lot about the Nika of the Void Century, as we know that was a man that was called Joy Boy, who ate a mythical Del fruit that transformed him into the character of Nika, literally embodying the warrior of liberation. And then later, of course, in the future, this was embodied again by Luffy, who became the second user of the Hitoitonomi model Nika. However, this fruit was based on a figure that existed in the first world, what was the original Nika. The issue is that the Harley simply describes that Nika as having appeared upon the world, who came to be revered as the sun god. However, we don't know in which form he really appeared, because we aren't even sure if the original Nika existed to begin with. Now, he did exist, but was he real or simply fictional? Several characters have expressed several times the fact that they believe Nika isn't a real figure or one that exists in a material form. Kuma believed that Nika ultimately wasn't real, just using him to cheer up Bonnie, and even Saturn affirmed this fact, someone who would be at least someone more privy to the events of history. From his very introduction, even Who's Who questioned whether Nika was real or if people dreamed him up, and the Hitoitonomi model Nika is a mythical fruit, thus based on a mythical creature. This also ties with the larger symbolism of Egghead, of Bonnie realizing that Nika wasn't real, but that he eventually became real through the mythical fruit of the Hitoitonomi model Nika. But none of these people were alive in the first world, so we can't say for sure. Perhaps Nika was a real person who later became myth and legend. Or maybe Nika never truly existed to begin with and was always a myth, but that still had a tangible impact on the world. I've proposed before the theory that Nika may originally have been a cartoonish character. And this is why he was known as Nika, Warrior of Liberation, just like fellow comic book character Sora, Warrior of the Sea. And this may be why Joy Boy came to have a superhero nickname, Joy Boy, because he transformed into Nika, a fictional superhero. And it might be why Nika is literally a living cartoon, stretching like rubber, just like an old cartoon. So perhaps Nika was originally just a cartoon character in the same way that Luffy is to us, the protagonist of a story that meant so much to those who suffered in the first world, and I feel that could be a very intentional parallel Oda is trying to draw with our world and what One Piece means to us. And people so deified and believed so much in this fictional character because he was the only thing that brought them salvation in their suffering and oppression. But again, at the same time, it's totally possible that Nika may have been a real person that the story was made after and only became a character as he became deified in the future when stories began talking about him. The details are just too vague, we don't know for sure, but we can at least rule out one thing, that the first Nika was a Del fruit user, as the Harley suggests that Del fruits were created during the Void Century. We also further don't know what effect Nika had on the world, as the Harley doesn't elaborate much beyond his first appearance. Another element unique to this period of time has been suggested to be the creation of the three ancient weapons. This is because even during the Void Century, they were seemingly already known as the ancient weapons, and they knew for a fact that the weapons such as Poseidon reappear upon the world over a span of fixed several hundreds of years, what appears to be a period of around 800 or so years. As such, there must have been a precedent to know when the weapons would reappear in the future again. The Harley mural also shows the enslaved building a boat with mother flames what may have been an original ship, such as the Pluton, a warship built in what would one day become Water 7. Alongside the two other weapons, the mermaid Poseidon, who can command the Sea Kings, and the seemingly flying airship Uranus, these three weapons were said to be named after gods. And if the One Piece world really is our own, then maybe these may have been the actual Greek gods after which our planets are named, also tying with the 5 elder planets. Each weapon seems to involve a person with some affinity for the voice of all things, some form of large creature, and a ship, but the details surrounding all this are still incredibly vague, so it's hard to say anything for sure. It's also possible that the people part of the ancient weapons may have existed since the First World, but that the ships like the Noah were created during the Void Century. But again, we're just speculating here, we just don't know for sure. However, following this, the Harley narrates a set of events that are particularly vague and mystified, so again, it's pretty hard to say. It claims that a figure known as the Earth God or Chi-no-Kami became enraged at the current situation, potentially due to all the pollution and over-urbanization of the planet as depicted in the Harley mural, where buildings and skyscrapers cover the world in concrete and smoke. This Earth God seemingly used a being known as the Hellflame Serpent to envelop the world in death and darkness. What this serpent is remains incredibly vague, but the mural suggests that it may have been in some form the Red Line, as the giants also refer to it in their culture as a serpent, being like the Jormungandr of Norse mythology that wraps around the world. The use of flame in Hellflame also suggests some connection with the Mother Flame, but as a result of it, through the Earth God, the Hellflame Serpent enveloped or quite literally wrapped up the world in death and darkness, bringing about a great calamity that resulted in another mass extinction event. In this case though, not one brought about by nature, but the first brought by humanity, bringing an end to what was called the First World. How this extinction event came to happen is unclear, but it at least involved the creation of the Red Line as we know it today. Whether the Grand Line was created during this period as well, or was a creation of the Void Century isn't fully clear, but by the way it was described, it very clearly nearly wiped a large part of mankind, but civilization nonetheless managed to survive, even if they lost the technology that made them so advanced in the first place, reverting to a more primitive state. The bigger question in this entire framework is just how far exactly the First World was from the Void Century. However, there is something that we could use as a frame of reference to calculate this, and that is the period of time with which the ancient weapons reappear upon the world. Because from the end of the Void Century, when Poseidon was active, to Shirahoshi today, it took around 800 years for Poseidon to reappear. And this doesn't seem to be a random number, as creatures like the Sea Kings were aware of what this time would be. So the previous Poseidon prior to the Void Century must have appeared and particularly died some 800 years or so prior to Poseidon's birth. And here's the thing, the One Piece world uses the Kaien Reki, the sea circle calendar, which sets the current story in the year 1524. The end of the Void Century was 800 years ago, so on the year 700 when Poseidon more or less appeared and eventually died. So if we go back another almost 800 years, we get right before the year 0 when the ancient weapons were made prior to the upcoming calamity of this potential year 0. Could it then be possible that the year 0 marked this great calamity, which is why the world used it as a new year 0? In fact, maybe year 0 could even mark the original appearance of Nika, in much the same way that the appearance of Jesus has been used as our point of reference for our current Gregorian calendar. We can't say for sure again, but this would make a lot of sense at least. This is unless we are assuming that the period of recovery between the First World and the Second World was much longer, and that the ancient weapons already reappeared more than once in the past. But I feel that it being around year 0 simply makes more sense in general, even if we can't say for sure. So just for fun, if we consider the calamity of the First World to be in our near future, like let's say more or less the year 2100 or so, then we could say that would set the Void Century in what would be for us the years 2700 to 2800, and the current One Piece world in what would be our year 3600. So it's still gonna be a while while until Luffy appears. Either way, our history lesson doesn't end here, as there's still a lot of things we know about between this original first world and our current world of the Void Century. For starters, as mentioned before, we have a hard date, which is the year 402 of Kaienreiki, what would be exactly 1122 years ago. In chapter 261, Robin found a monolith near Shandora, which served as a grave talking of this legendary city. This city of gold, completely plated over in solid gold, was the home of the Shandia, one of the races of angels, and was cited as being a city that was prospering, as marked in the year 402 Kaienreiki on the monolith, showing that it remained prosperous for another 3 centuries up until the end of the Void Century, which is when it was invaded by what were becoming, at the time, government forces, who were trying to seize the poneglyph they were given. This led to a collapse of the city, but ultimately the Shandia won and drove the government away, if at the cost of many losses. As such, the city fell into ruin and the Shandia began living in more humble buildings outside the city, but its golden beauty still remained until the present, when it was sacked by Enel. I'm getting ahead of myself though. Another early date that we possess is the birth of Zunisha. According to the Vivre cards, Zunisha is over 1000 years old, which means that Zunisha must have been born prior to the year 500, making it already at least 200 years old by the end of the Void Century. As a Naitame no Lida elephant, it seems that it likely was always destined to live very long. Something that also happened around 1000 years ago is around the year 500, the 1000-Year War, a conflict between the Longarm and Longleg races that has spanned 1000 years. If you thought the real-life 100-Year War was bad enough, just wait until you hear this one. Yes, their petty grudge is even older than the Void Century itself, embarrassingly enough, though the Harley does at least show them fighting together in a potential future final conflict, so hopefully by then the Longarms and Longlegs will have put their differences aside. We also do know of the formation and existence of several civilizations that span to either around or before the start of the Void Century. For one, Fishman Island was first formed by ancestor fishmen and mermen who were driven out of the surface by humans due to discrimination, forced to go to the seafloor in the only spot where light reached, thanks to the roots of the bioluminescent Sun Tree Eve, as the Rigo Kingdom was already long established by the time Poseidon appeared in the Void Century. And this also suggests that the Sun Tree Eve is quite old too, as likely was the Treasure Tree Adam too, particularly with Loki calling the mountains that surround it having existed for tens of thousands of years, which, I mean, makes sense geologically, they are mountains. Another historical country beyond the aforementioned Alabasta Kingdom would be the Wano country, which already has been long established by the end of the Void Century as a powerful shogunate led by the Kozuki clan, which had been erected on the shores of the volcanic mountain island of Mount Fuji. But a very important one would be the Dressrosa Kingdom, which had existed since prior to the Void Century, and in chapter 726 we even get a visual glimpse as to how Dressrosa looked back then. The royal plateau already existed, but the cities looked fairly different. Instead of the current modernist look based on modern Spain, it was based on older, more ancient Spanish architecture. This panel also shows a banknote that, if you look closely, features a large B on it, suggesting that the belly or berry was already in use as far back as prior to the Void Century. The history of Dressrosa is particularly important though, as it also involves the history of the Tontata race from the nearby island of Green Bit. They had set out looking for resources on other islands, but were almost driven to extinction by humans trying to hunt them down. As such, the neighboring king of Dressrosa, a king of the Don Quixote dynasty, offered the Tontata an alliance, offering resources in exchange for labor. This was, however, all a trick, as King Don Quixote had the Tontata enslaved, forced to toil away as their work helped provide wealth for Dressrosa, enriching the country at the cost of their suffering. This is the period of time that they described, at least from their perspective, as the era of slaves, being the historical era that spanned all the way up to the Void Century in the year 600. And it is not the only account of it, as clearly slaves and oppressed people suffered all across the world, an escalation that likely led to the events of the Void Century, where people wished for liberation. Another very important civilization, however, was the Lunaria, who had a settlement atop the Red Line, 9 what was called a godland or kami no kuni, a god country, the type of country model that Skypiea also operates under, as it's also formally referred to as Godland Skypiea. It's been suggested that the Lunaria were an artificially augmented species, particularly being so much more biologically superior than all other angels and having a portable mother flame on their backs. As such, the Lunaria may have been some of the pioneers, or at least major contributors, to reawakening technology and rediscovering the bloodline elements, the mother flame, and other technological advancements by studying the past and recovering all these lost advancements. Around this time, around 900 years ago, close to or around the beginning of the Void Century, was the manufacturing date of Emmet, the Iron Giant, as part of these technological advancements, a fully sentient robot similar to the automata of the moon. With this came the rise of an incredibly powerful kingdom, what was either very closely associated or downright fundamentally formed by the people of the D clan. And as the Harley says, the people of the D clan, the Half Moon, and the people of the moon, the Lunaria, work together hand in hand to develop the mother flame for the good of the world, likely dreaming of a world where it could bring prosperity to people. But its reappearance would also lead to the potential for greed to reappear and wish to use it for control. Mankind found itself at another crossroads as it entered the century of the 600s, as the appearance of an important historical figure would change the course of history forever. The first pirate, Joy Boy. That, as they say, is history, but a part of history that has fallen to the void.